Welcome to our prologue episode for the inaugural season of Mundaria Legends. My name is Michael Stone. We are excited for the launch of this new podcast series coming to you December 10th. And so, though we'll still need to wait for our first few episodes to premiere, I am excited to bring to you what you could call a pilot episode of sorts. Before we begin, however, as a reminder, this new fantasy series is meant to be uniquely yours. Submit your character ideas to this podcast at mundarialegends.com, and you might even get it featured in our first episodes. Now, get ready. We're going to take you to a time in Mundaria where its nations are only just beginning to reach out to one another after the cataclysmic throne wars, and all its peoples face the uncertainty of whether anyone can be trusted. We find ourselves in the capital of Maeli, a kingdom of the seas that is about to learn that what you don't know most definitely can hurt you. At this stage of life, all Geralt wanted was a little peace, and he wasn't likely to get it from this upcoming Senate session. He so hated meetings. Surprise meetings like this session were ranked even lower on his list. But then again, while power had its perks, he had to be willing to pay its costs. A life as one of the most influential senators in Maeli wasn't all comfort women and drinking after all. Yet at least scheduled meetings gave Geralt the time to walk a little more slowly. His 80-year-old legs would definitely be in need from a healer's attention after this meeting was over. The Merfolk, of course, would be able to gracefully swim their way to the rotunda, but as the rickety old frame of a human that he was, Geralt would have to keep a brisk and uncomfortable pace to answer the emergency summons to this Senate session. Thankfully, his silver hair was still tidily kept, and he was even able to have someone fetch his better toga. So, even if he was a little out of breath, he'd at least be looking his best. Which, when being a senator walking past the majestic columns in this marbled hallway to the rotunda, was something important after all. Geralt again felt the need to needle his aide, as he groaned, "Couldn't this have waited until tomorrow? It's nearly time for a fossil like myself to retire for the night." Anton, his mercrab assistant, continued to clack and click his way down the marbled hallway in front of Geralt. His anxiety seemed to be bubbling over, as was the froth in his mouth, as his many legs skittered across the floor. How the spindly little aide managed to navigate his way across the smooth floors of the Maeli Capitol building was a mystery to Geralt, though it wasn't like the old human had the patience or the appetite to care to learn. Anton's lobster-like body with its 4 arms were adept enough at carrying around Geralt's notes for him, and somehow his beady all-black eyes were able to focus on the aging senator even as Anton crawled forward. And that was good enough for the senator. "As I told you, sir, I was just informed about this emergency summons but half an hour ago. I know as little as you do, sir," the old crustacean wheezed. "And any Senate meeting cannot be rescheduled without the majority decision of its members, a decision that cannot be made without the written consent of said majority, or through a vote of the same during a meet—" "It was a rhetorical question, Anton," Geralt gruffly warned. He, of course, knew that the Senate would be so obsequious as to require a meeting to reschedule a meeting, but he didn't need the rulebook quoted to him to rub the proverbial salt into the wound. The mercrab tilted his eye stalks forward as he walked, which Geralt had come to learn was his way of nodding his assent. "Of course, sir. And while I have you, there is the matter of your daughter. What is your decision?" Geralt rolled his eyes and massaged his temples. "I had told that woman that she was her daughter to take care of. If she can't pay for the girl's healing, she can take out a loan, like everyone else." Again the eye stalks tilted forward. "As you wish, sir. I'll draft a response in your office while you are in session." Geralt gave a non-committal grunt. "Just remember, Anton, be sure you don't make the same mistakes as me. One of the most draining and mind-numbing wastes of time you can have as a proper leader of this people is dealing with family matters. You'd best let family not matter." Anton began to walk down a perpendicular hallway towards the offices of each of the senators. "Understood, sir," he offered in his typical monotone. As Graal entered the large rotunda at the end of the hall, he gazed around to see that over half of the senators had already gathered, which was impressive even to him. Most were merfolk, not necessarily because they believed in being prompt, but more so because this city was their capital after all. Only a few merfolk could still be seen swimming up from the depths, visible through the thick, transparent glass flooring of the chamber. Each new arrival from the depths swam up to the water's surface, exposed by a semicircle opening around the far periphery of the rotunda. Palatine bearers waited to escort their august clients to their seats, while some of the ocean-dwelling senators, like the mercrabs, required no such assistance. Graal's fellow human representatives filed in, as he did, through the main hall entrance. Assuming his seat at the far right side of the room near the front, Graal broadcasted his smirking frown to anyone who would dare look his way. He wanted it to be clear he didn't have the patience for any of the insincere, superficial greetings or idle chatter the other senators were using to disguise whatever self-serving machinations they were pursuing today. Graal's goal was simple: get the meeting done quickly, get out, and forget about whatever he'd be likely pressured into doing by his caucus. Just a little peace was all he wanted. Leela, an elderly merfolk senator already reclining in her seat just behind Graal's, seemed to take pleasure in Graal's discomfiture.
"What's the matter, my misanthropic miser? Did you lose a tooth today? Or were you just disappointed to have woken up at all?"
Leela gave a small chuckle as she added,
"Because, if it is the latter, trust me, you're not the only one frustrated by your continued existence."
Graal huffed slowly, blowing off the surge of loathing he was experiencing. So much for avoiding conversation. "Senator Leela, I thought I smelled a dead fish somewhere, and here I thought your kind enjoyed taking baths." Leela laughed all the louder. When she was younger, she may have had a more alluring giggle, but a lifetime of reckless self-indulgence at the top rungs of Maeli society had developed a sickly, pacey set of jowls that rippled with her deep-throated cackle.
"And here I thought this meeting would be boring. As backward and idiotic as you are, I must say I do truly look forward to hearing your disapproving scoffs."
Graal sneered, unimpressed by the old hag's attempts at repartee. "Was there a point to addressing me, or would you happen to prove useful for at least one time in your life and convince someone to begin this meeting?" Leela gave a brief harumph, as if having just been told that the market had run out of fresh kelp.
"It's not like you to be so eager to get to the business at hand, Geary."
That wasn't the first time that Leela had used that unwelcome pet name for the elderly senator, but he still had to resist the urge to roll his eyes automatically each time she said it.
"Though I suppose that for once you might actually have reason to show some interest in these proceedings. What with the king's son missing and all."
In spite of himself, Graal spun his head around just in time to see Leela's twisted smile. Graal's eyes narrowed. "Just what are you playing at, Leela? Your jokes are becoming even less coherent as you age. Senility doesn't become you, old fish."
No joke here," his sweet voice echoed. "The king does have a son, and he just went missing this morning. And you don't have to take my word for it. Look, they are propping up the prince's picture on an easel now. I suppose they want us to be able to recognize him if we'd seen him."
Hushes were indeed beginning to fall over the gathered assembly. As the senators pointed towards the front of the room, boisterous greetings quickly melting into intrigued whispers. A painting was being propped up on a stand for all to see, illuminated by 2 torches fastened to columns on either side of the artwork. The figure in the painting was that of a strikingly graceful and fashionable young merman, with distinctive red and blue fins protruding from both sides of the otherwise human-like face, fins that Graal had only seen on the king. And those eyes, those steady brown eyes, could only have come from the queen. She had a son before she died then, Geralt assessed. And he's got to be at least 15 years old by the looks of that painting. I'm impressed. They managed to hide that one for a long time. And here I thought we'd be needing to elect a new king soon, before we saw another coronation. The animosity towards Leela put to the side for the moment by this curious development, Geralt turned in his seat and asked, "How is it that you knew about this? And why would the king have hidden his heir? It's not like he's especially fond of us. He's publicly lamented the fact that we were likely going to elect the next king, instead of rubber-stamping a blooded successor." Leela reclined in her seat, tenting her fingers as she shared her thoughts.
To be honest, I hadn't heard this boy had existed until just some moments ago, when some friends of mine had spotted the king's guards bringing that towards this hole. The painting even has the son's name and title engraved in the frame along the bottom, though I assume all our associates like you will be able to easily infer who he is based on those splendid royal features.
Something told Geralt that it was no accident that Leela's friends had been monitoring the activity of the king's guards. Not that he was unduly offended by the idea of senatorial spies, not when he employed his own.
As to why the boy was hidden, well, that's the question, isn't it? Leela continued. Though this boy's existence does seem to explain a different mystery. The queen must have died very close to the time when he was born.
Geralt did the math in his head. Almost 16 years. So the sudden fever we were told about was likely a complication of the delivery. That's different. Leela's eyebrows cocked upward.
Different from what, Kiri?
Geralt felt an unfamiliar disquiet as he gave voice to his realization. The king had always seemed so distant from his wife. I'd always thought that he wasn't too fond of her. True, he hasn't remarried since, but... Leela curled her lips, nodding in a kind of detached, yet still grim agreement.
It seems you are capable of some observation, Geary. Though don't let our other colleagues hear you say things like that. The king's done rather well convincing the rest of them that he actually loves the peace we've had since the throne wars.
She rolled her eyes at what she evidently deemed a ludicrous proposition.
Yes, for some time I had also suspected that the king may have arranged for his wife's untimely demise. But it appears that both our cynicism was misplaced. At least, she thoughtfully added, in this case.
The thick carapace of skepticism that Geralt had carried with him into the rotunda seemed to soften. Was he so old? Had he seen and heard so much that he couldn't trust anyone to have some innocence left in their lives? His brows furrowed, contemplating what this discovery implied. If it was true that the king really had lost his wife during a pregnancy, perhaps there was a reason Geralt had never seen him greet any other person too warmly. And this prince is missing? How is it that you caught wind of that, Leela? Geralt didn't bother to hide the accusation in his voice, wishing to ensure that the old fish knew that even if he was speaking with her, that it did not mean they were suddenly allies. Leela gave Geralt a knowing smile, much as would an artisan to her apprentice after having produced a passable work.
Through legitimate channels, of course. I don't want to bore you with the details. The timing of all of this is very odd, however, the old merwoman whispered. The king's heretofore unheard-of son disappearing, just as we have again begun making contact with some of the other nations of Mundaria. It doesn't make any sense for some other nation to go out of their way to go after the king like this. It has taken centuries for everyone to rebuild after the throne wars.
The second mention of that cataclysm caused a hollow disquiet to fill Geralt. A high elf merchant had told him once something of those wars, the ageless man having had a mother fight in them. If even half of what he had heard from that merchant was true, The world on fire. Unending screams of the innocent through the night. The entire natural world summoned to fight for the ambitions of magic-wielding tyrants. Another such general war among the nations was the last thing the fragile surviving world needed. Leela continued her analysis, oblivious to Geralt's sobering thoughts.
No, it can't have been a foreign agent. Someone who has better spies than me must have found out the king's secret and is probably holding the brat hostage. That's likely why the king has called us here, to perchance corner the real culprit. But I suppose that King Orlem himself will explain what is going on, she observed, gesturing towards the gaudy palanquin that was now making its way from the back of the rotunda, from behind many of the senators' seats. Conch shell horns trumpeted as the palanquin made its way towards the front of the rotunda. Everyone with legs stood, and all others raised their assorted tridents, spears, and swords towards the ceiling in tribute. The long, pleasant resonance of the conch shells echoed as the corpulent body of King Orlem was hoisted into his chair. What it was about the merfolk and their fascination with thrones was beyond Geralt. Though, being the dominant political and economic force in Maeli, they seemed to enjoy snubbing land dwellers by forcing them to carry them around when on land. Geralt thanked the gods that he wasn't one of those palanquin bearers, as the corpulent royal disembarked and then rolled himself slowly, and Geralt thought, somewhat indecorously, onto his wide throne. The king stared around at the gathered assembly once he had positioned himself to his satisfaction in his chair, his girthy bare torso still wet from the seawater he had just emerged from, his dark blue and red scaly tail reflecting the chamber's moderately dimmed light as it rested to his side. And though Geralt had never seen the king look happy or relaxed in his living memory, he was taken aback by the rage he saw on the king's face. The same red and blue fins from his son's painting taut with fierce anger on either side of the king's violent eyes. The room did not need much time at all to quiet down before the king felt he was ready to speak. Geralt raised his hand to his chin, for once actually believing that perhaps there was something worthwhile that was about to be discussed in this room.
I realize that there are those among you who think very little of me,
the king began. His voice was subdued, but thanks to the room's architect, the royal did not need to raise his voice too much to be heard, as his stern address reverberated around the rotunda.
Though I have dedicated my life to this kingdom, though I have helped bring about the most prosperous age our peoples have known, there are still some of you that think it wise to counsel your king and to question his judgment. What's worse is that someone here, in this very chamber, has evidently taken this animosity towards me so far as to commit the basest of crimes and the greatest of treasons I have lived to see.
This was a different kind of anger than what Geralt had come to be accustomed to from King Orlem. Usually Orlem's baseline emotion in the rotunda was that of dignified calm, with only occasional outbursts of disdain at the discovery of some scandal of one senator or another. This wasn't the kind of anger a king channeled at an incompetent servant or an upstart body of senators. This was beginning to feel like the wrath of a father who had lost the last dear thing to him in this world. Death sight take us all, Geralt thought. Leela's informants were right.
Someone here has been clever enough to discover that I have a son,
the deep, regal voice of the king stated with a threatening tone as he gestured to the painting.
I had hoped that by keeping him secret all these years, that would have protected him from the machinations of this body. I had wished he would have been sheltered from your coarse greed and crass ambitions.
As the king scanned the room, his head shaking with the ire of a disbelieving parent in grief, all were quiet. Geralt, like many of the other senators, were transfixed by the sight of the man, who usually was a coolly unperturbed king, now using all his self-control to try to restrain his boiling anger.
But that is who you all are. I had known somehow that giving any of you any degree of power was a mistake. You're like leeches from the shallows, ever draining me of my health, but never satisfied. Governance for you is a career. For me, it has always been about my family.
Geralt noticed that the guards had closed and locked the doors to the rotunda. Grates were being pulled over the watery entrance from which moments ago the king himself and his fellow merfolk had entered the chamber. A stark chill, and for the first time in decades, fear ran down Geralt's spine. At the loud clanking shut of the rotunda's doors, some senators began to panic, as one of the other human senators in the room cried out, "He means to kill us! He's going to kill us all!"
"Silence, you scum!"
the king bellowed.
"Believe me, while I am dreadfully tempted to end this governing body's loathsome existence here and now, I at least have decided to live in honor. And an honorable king does not kill the innocent. An honorable person does not target the guiltless. That much, it seems, has not occurred to whoever took my son."
Geralt gasped. The king actually was on the brink of breaking down. No wonder the king had hidden his son. He actually cared. He had wanted to protect him. Geralt's thoughts ever so briefly turned to his daughter. A horrible, twisting kind of pain began to swell within him. No. He couldn't think about that now. Couldn't afford to. Orlum held back tears as he finished.
"And so, I am giving whoever did this, if they are here, this one chance to find the smallest degree of mercy from my wrath. Surrender yourself now! Or, if any of the rest of you have seen my son," the king gestured towards the painting, "tell me who it is here that has taken him. For I know that I have no enemies in this wide sea, except for those who stand here, in this room."
The king leaned forward in his throne, peering dangerously from his seat, as his guards similarly pierced the gathered senators' faces with their stares. Orlum slowly articulated his question.
"Where is my son?"
Absolute silence followed the king's imperious query. Time seemed to freeze as all eyes gazed around, waiting for someone to confess or to perchance wake them from this bizarre nightmare. From the back seats, finally, a slow, clapping noise, somewhat like a fish out of water flopping on pavement, rang out. All eyes turned to the disturbance, as Geralt slowly began to realize that the sound actually was clapping. A hooded figure began to walk slowly from the back of the room. The guards immediately moved to place themselves between the king and this new stranger. Something in the pit of Geralt's stomach was telling him to turn and run, to try to get the guards to open the doors and let them out. But then the hooded figure dropped their hood. Like many of the rotunda's occupants, the visitor was scaled. But where one would expect fins around the head, there were instead horns, not unlike those of a ram. Orange eyes glowed from the lizard-like face, and where there should have been fingers, there were instead black claws. Geralt and Leela gasped at the same time. By the Daeon, it was a draconid. "Excellent speech, King Orlum," the scaly dragonborn visitor hissed. "I do believe that has to be the most authenticity this chamber has seen in a long time. I believe I can start to answer your question." Geralt's mind was racing. How? They had just opened diplomatic relations with the draconids of Cruz. Everything Geralt knew about their islands indicated that they were in desperate need of Maeli's assistance, and were in no shape to antagonize other nations. What was the meaning of this? King Orlum did not hesitate. He called out to his guards, "Seize him!" The visitor gave no resistance, smiling all the while as human guards accosted and brought him forward to the king. Orlum's rage was palpable as he locked his gaze with the Draconids.
"You heard my questions, scum! Where is he? What have you done to him?"
The Draconid laughed mirthlessly. "There is no need for such hostility, my regal friend. Your son is fine. In fact, I've come bearing a message from him." Outrage seemed to broil behind Orlum's eyes. Geralt looked towards the exits, wondering if it would be a good idea to quietly make his way out. No, the guards there might find that suspicious. Seeing as the king's rage was focused on this newcomer, the danger was also likely relatively low for Geralt and his associates, for the moment. The Draconid made as if to pull something from his robes. As the guards who were holding him tightened their grip on his arms, however, the Draconid patiently looked up at the king. "I would assume your majesty would like to see the message." Resolution burned from the king's stare.
"Give me his message, if indeed that's your real purpose here, snake. Now! And know that if your people have done anything to hurt him, that they will be praying for mercy at my hand."
Something about the Draconid's grin unsettled Geralt to his core. Something about all this was very wrong. Message? Why would the king's secret son disappear without explanation, then send a Draconid of all things to send word? Something was not adding up. His arms now free from the guard's grip, the Draconid pulled something out of his robes. It wasn't parchment as Geralt had been expecting. It was instead something even smaller and more limp. The Draconid dropped it on the ground, and addressing the king, he loudly announced, "Your son is alive, O king. But hear this. He has seen through your lies, and knows of your family's secret." Orlum's face contorted with even more anger. The Draconid continued, "He has sought asylum with us, your Crucian neighbors, so that he may live free of the sinful taint of your extravagant exploitation of your people. And we have decided to honor that request." Geralt's mouth hanged open in wide amazement.
"What foolishness is this?"
Geralt shouted as he stood, trying to sound more brave than he really was feeling.
"You cannot be from Cruz. Enough with these lies. Cruz is our ally. What lies are you trying to spread here?"
The Draconid turned towards Geralt, grinning ever more widely. "The prince knew that some here would doubt his sincerity. Insincerity is a tradition you, Ma'eli, have practiced to perfection, after all." The lizard then pointed towards what he had dropped on the rotunda floor, which did not look dissimilar from a small bundled-up set of rags. "Look at that, if you will. See your prince's message for yourselves. Know this, however. We will honor the prince's wishes. And know, King Orlum, I don't think it will be my people who shall be the ones praying for mercy." At that, the Draconid's robes flew off as he revealed a massive set of wings. Blown back by the sudden movement of the scaly messenger's wings, the guards could only cry out in surprise and anger as the Draconid flew straight out of the rotunda through the circular oculus in the ceiling. As the senators around the room began shouting and discord broke forth, the king raised his hand to silence the legislators. Pointing towards the rags on the ground, the small hand-sized package that the Draconid had left was brought to the king by one of the guards. As the king turned it around, Geralt finally saw that it was no heap of rags, but something that rather resembled a small fabric merman. It was a toy. The king was transfixed by the toy. The rage and anger on his face softened to remorse as he held it in his hands. Geralt was stupefied. This was a young infant's toy. Why would a teenaged princeling, or a Draconid for that matter, have anything to do with a doll of all things? But though the king's voice was much quieter now, thanks to the silence of the rest of the room and the acoustics of the rotunda, Graal could clearly hear the mournful regret in Ulrum's voice.
Kyral, my boy, what have I done? What have I done?
The king raised his hands to the small toy's head, apparently to rub some dirt off the front of it. As he did so, a glow came to life on the toy's face. Sorrow from the monarch turned to alarm in a split second. Then the toy exploded, a large fireball consuming the king and the guards nearby. Searing heat knocked Graal and his fellow senators back, as the rotunda began to buckle and strain at the loss of 2 columns that had been near the king. The roar of the fire muted any screams Graal could have heard, as he looked up and saw a rock hurtling from its place in the ceiling towards his skull. Then darkness took him.
Sir, are you awake? Sir, please wake up.
Graal blinked slowly as he began to look at his surroundings. A massive, throbbing pain seized his head, which, as he put his hand up to it, was covered in warm, sticky blood. Graal had looked out. The rock had not been so big as to have instantly killed him, but he wasn't so sure that death still wasn't coming for him. When he opened his eyes wider, part of him wished it had already come. The capital was in chaos. The rotunda was smoking from explosion in the sunset. It seemed as if some hydromancers had quickly risen to the occasion to put out the flames with their water magic, but the damage was still severe. And all around him, Graal could see the bodies of the other senators on stretchers, many of them severely wounded from the blast, while some were unmoving, covered by white shrouds. Blade hands spare us, Graal thought. It was a massacre.
I'm awake. What happened?
The guards looked at each other.
Someone reported that a draconid had flown out of the ceiling of the Capitol Rotunda just before it exploded with fire. We were hoping you could tell us anything you remember.
Graal stared forward, his gaze fixed on the smoking building. It had only recently been erected, the official place of business for the fledgling democracy that the king had established with the creation of the Senate. Now, too soon, it had been burnt to ashes. Graal made as if to stand up, but was held in place by the guards. One of them gently told the senator,
"Don't get up. We don't know exactly what state you are in. It might be dangerous to move you until we get a healer to you. Senator, do you remember anything?"
Graal looked around, hearing the moans of the people towards whom he had just earlier today felt nothing but contempt. And, next to him, he saw Leela, her eyes staring unblinkingly forward, as she too had a white shroud placed gently over her body as Graal looked on. That Graal could not believe what he was seeing, much less alone what he was feeling, was an understatement. How could such a stupidly bureaucratic thing have turned into this nightmare? How dare these idiot politicians die? And his daughter, why? Why was he thinking of her?
Sir, are you there?
The guard's urgent voice was not enough to shake Graal from his shock. As the faces of the guards surrounding Graal flickered in the candlelight, other faces flashed in his memory. Kyral, the prince's son, staring unblinkingly from a painting. Yulia, his wife, in tears as he left her in a courtroom. And his daughter. What was her name? Why couldn't he remember her name? And why did that hurt? All Graal could do was look at the guards trying to keep him conscious, wishing once again, but in a very different way, for just a little peace. And, as oblivion took him, his wish was granted. Thanks for tuning in. Today's episode featured a character inspired by John from Wyoming, who imagined a draconid sorcerer whose mastery of flame would be feared by all. Thanks for the inspiration, John. As we approach our premiere date on December 10th, Remember that we want to feature your characters and your stories. Do you have a character idea for our premiere episodes? Submit your suggestion at MundariaLegends.com, where you can also find out more about the lore, history, and magic of Mundaria. Remember to like, subscribe, and follow the show, and leave us your comments of what you thought. We are excited to hear from you. And again, mark those calendars for December 10th as we begin Season 1 of Mundaria Legends.